The 3060 12GB was originally released in 2021, and because of memory constraints from the AI market, this card has been re-released at around $339, and that puts it in a really weird spot. A lot of newer cards around this price will come with 8 gigs of VRAM. Meanwhile, this card from 2021 has 12 gigs. That doesn't mean it's faster, that doesn't mean it's automatically a good buy, but it does make it interesting, especially for Tarkov, because Tarkov is not like most modern games. The CPU and RAM side control most of your actual FPS, but the GPU still decides what resolution and settings you can play at. So I wanted to see what the 3060 12GB can actually do in Tarkov today in 2026 from 1080 to 4K and see whether this old card still has a real place in a Tarkov build. So like I said earlier, Tarkov is not like a lot of newer games built on modern engines where hardware scaling is more straightforward. This game was built over a decade ago on Unity and it is extremely CPU heavy, to the point where your CPU and RAM probably make up something like 80 to 85% of your actual performance in this game. And that's why two systems with totally different GPUs can sometimes get the same FPS if the CPU is the same. But then I see people take that idea a little too far. They hear Tarkov is CPU bound and then they start saying the GPU doesn't matter at all. And that's one of the biggest myths around this game. The GPU is absolutely still a critical portion of your build in Tarkov, okay? It just matters in a different way than it does in most games. The easiest way to think about it is like this. Your CPU determines your FPS ceiling, your GPU determines what resolution and settings you can play at while staying near that ceiling. So if you take something like a 9800X3D and pair it with a 5090 at 1080, and then take that same 9800X3D and pair it with something lower like a 5060, you'll probably have the same FPS at 1080. At that point, the CPU is still the bottleneck. The GPU is not pushing your FPS higher in the same way it would in a lot of other games. So the GPU is still a critical part of a Tarkov build. It just decides the resolution and visual target more than the raw FPS ceiling, if that makes sense. And that's also why a 3060 12GB with the high-end X3D CPU is not as weird as it sounds for a Tarkov build. In a normal gaming build, a lot of people will say that pairing a 9800X3D with a 3060 12GB does not make sense. And for most games, I'd agree, but Tarkov is different. If your goal is 1080 Tarkov, the 3060 12GB can still be completely viable when the CPU is strong enough. So I started with 1080 native. That's the resolution I'd target with this card. I use my Pure 70 settings, which is my optimized medium texture presets. And you can see that 3060 is handling it no problem. We are still CPU bound here. The introduction of DLSS4 has been a literal game changer for Tarkov, because it actually looks better than native aliasing, even if you use quality as a scaling option. It's that good. So that makes the GPU requirements even lower because you can use scaling and still get better visuals than you would going native. So here's what it looks like in DLSS4 Quality. Everything looks sharper, there's less stair stepping and shimmering in the distance. So while this card is optimal for 1080, with DLSS, you can go up to 1440 and the graphics still look pretty good. I'm running 1440 DLSS4 in Balanced and visually it still looks awesome. I think even 1440 Balanced looks better than 1080 native. So the fact that it can get up to this point, I think is pretty cool. This is probably going to be the limit for visual settings. If you want to go up to 1440, you'll probably have to go Balanced on DLSS. 4K is where it starts to get pushed past where it belongs. Even with DLSS Ultra Performance, this is not really the resolution I would build around with this card. I mean, it runs and it's not awful, but we're hitting the GPU's limits and it's definitely the bottleneck here. There are two main things I wanted to show with this benchmark: how the 3060 12GB performs in Tarkov with a strong CPU, and what resolution and settings you can expect to play in. In most games, I think people think about CPU and GPU pairing in a pretty traditional way. If you have a high-end CPU, you must have a high-end GPU. If you have a mid-range CPU, you must pair it with a mid-range GPU and so on. But Tarkov doesn't work that way. If you care mainly about Tarkov performance, the CPU and RAM side will determine your FPS ceiling more than the GPU. That doesn't make the GPU irrelevant. It's still critical because it determines what resolution and settings you're going to play in, and that's what you're looking at the whole time. So that's a pretty big deal. So the 3060 12GB for 1080, it's excellent. For 1440, still pretty good. For 4K, I probably wouldn't go there with this card. If you're considering buying one of these now, price is everything. 12 gigabytes of VRAM make this card at least interesting compared to, let's say, a 5060 or a 9060 XT, but it's really not that much cheaper than any of those cards, and that's where the value proposition starts to fall apart, because those new cards will have updated architecture and newer features. But as a Tarkov card specifically, the 3060 12 gig definitely still has a place. So the reason this GPU is back in the conversation at all is because VRAM matters, budget GPUs are still in a weird place, and Tarkov doesn't scale like a normal game. The CPU is the star of the show, but the show can't go on without the crew, right? So yeah, I'm trying something a little different with this one. Instead of just showing the benchmark footage and letting it run, I wanted to actually talk through the results a little bit and explain what I found interesting. This is less of a full scripted review and more just me sharing my thoughts while the benchmark plays. So let me know what you think of this format. If you like the commentary, I can do more benchmark videos like this instead of just posting straight gameplay with the FPS overlay. Hope you guys found it interesting. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.